I've got a quick question for you before we get started today. Were there any outstanding presentations at the last Master Brewers District meeting you attended? I bet there were. Well, we'd like to share those stories with listeners, but we need your help. Unless they attended that same district meeting, Master Brewers members, including me, will never know about these outstanding presentations unless they get uploaded to the Master Brewers District Presentations Archive. So next time you sit in on a really great presentation, ask your district officers if you can help them get the presentations uploaded. It's super easy. There's even a short how-to video link at the top of the archive. And if there's a presentation that you think we should highlight here on the show, shoot me a quick message. You can find me at community.mbaa.com. This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
Barley is a very visceral product. You know, it's incredibly ancient, and there is a wonderful story to tell there. And the fun part has been watching maltsters and brewers engaging in that dialogue for a couple of years now. Now what you have is this continuum of malt opportunities for brewers of all sizes to engage in, and it's just really exciting.
That was the voice of my friend Susan Welsh, who is a recent past president of Master Brewers. You won't hear Susan on this episode, but you will hear one of her colleagues as we talk about craft malt, winter barley, AMBA's guidelines for all malt brewers, and more.
Hi, my name is Dave Kuske. I'm with Proximity Malt.
Hi, my name is Tim Matthews. I'm with the Canonicky Craft Brewery Collective.
Before we get started, I just want to express some gratitude. Proximity Malt has been a sponsor of this show for more than a year now, which we really appreciate because we couldn't produce this show without financial support from sponsors like you. So thank you for that. It means a lot.
Our pleasure.
Next, I'll mention that this episode is totally unrelated to the sponsorship. Nobody from Proximity has ever pushed us to feature the company or anything like that. We're here today because I think there's an interesting story to tell that's related to a lot of the conversations Susan Welsh and I have had over the last decade about craft malt, about winter barley, about malting technology, and about some of the concepts Joe Hertrick has done such a good job of explaining here on the show. And let's start with Joe, because it's always good to start with Joe. If you go back to episodes 88 and 89, Joe explained how North American 2-row barley evolved to take on 6-row traits and why that's bad for all malt brewers. The American Malting Barley Association began publishing different specification targets for adjunct brewers versus all malt brewers back in 2012. We'll get into that as well as the recent updates soon. But for now, I'd like you to talk about how malting has evolved in recent years to better meet those all malt brewing targets. Because maltsters can't just wait for the lengthy barley breeding cycle. They've got to make malt for craft brewers today.
I would say the evolution there is really trying to work with the best barley packages that are or best barley varieties that are out there and available through the through the AMBA program, and to say we really have to sort through what is available. There have been very few rollouts in terms of this particular variety is absolutely dedicated to craft. I know we had craft as a variety come through, but that never really caught on. I think the majority of folks are looking at that deck and going, what can we do internally? What barley varieties can we pick? And how can we put those through the process accordingly to get the profiles at what the craft brewer is looking for? And you look at what those profiles are. It's a more muted enzyme package. It's a lower protease package in total, lower total protein, lower soluble protein, lower free amino nitrogen, and that lends itself to a few varieties that are out there. I know Copeland has been one that's been used and repeatedly used over the years here, but looking at that and going, what you don't want to do is a maltster is to cut a barley variety short. And I believe Joe talks about that in some of his discussions there, and to say, purposely under-modifying a particular barley to hit a malt specification is never a good choice there. You're much better finding a variety that's more suited to the malting process, having careful control of the malting process, make sure that you do get uniform and uniform modification and breakdown, let that barley become what it wants to become rather than what you want to make it become as artificially as a maltster.
Tim, how about from your perspective?
The last 10 years have been just a huge learning experience for brewers. In order for brewers to be part of this entire equation, brewers have had to learn how to even talk this language. It's not something that is heavily, when I did my brewing learning 15 plus years ago, it wasn't a big focus. We didn't know exactly what malting, the intricacies of malting and how it varies based upon the variety. So it has been a huge education process in the last 10 years. And you could actually see it at AMBA in the last 5 years, where participation by craft brewers has grown immensely. It's definitely a multiplayer game when it was definitely just a few players before. But that literacy of malt has for brewers has been a huge step in helping everybody engage this and getting to the point, getting to these different metrics of malt that are definitely more, conducive to the craft brewing all malt style. In the end, it doesn't help if brewers don't understand about modification, understand uniformity, and understand the effect of excess or even the deficiency of amino acids. They don't understand that, and they can't look at their brewing process and their beer and actually determine an effect, cause and effect. Then this goes nowhere. So that has been, the advent of literacy of malt and barley, malting, and malt in craft beer has definitely helped, and it's been one of the most visible events in the last couple of years.
Talk about what it means to U.S. brewers now that domestic maltsters are shortening the development pipeline by exploring European genome barley varieties.
Well, if anything, it's getting rid of the mystery and the mystique of these varieties like the Maris Auditors and the Barca and Golden Promise, not to say that those varieties were not well deserving of their mystique. Dave touched on many times on the certain varieties are made to malt a certain way. I mean, they have their malting path already laid out, and therefore the finished product is going to be a certain way. These varieties have a lot of good genomic details per se, and bringing those into the fold. When it just expands the, repertoire that the breeders have, and we're going to look at why do these Pilsner's malt in Germany have this protein structure, and why do why do these barley varieties in England are able to achieve such controlled modification and still get great flavor through the curing process? It will definitely take everything we have with the varieties adjusted to the climate and environment and land in North America, but now find ways and find markers that could achieve the brewing quality we want for craft brewers. At least that's the hope.
Dave, do you want to talk a little bit about how, I believe, I could be wrong about this, that you guys do leverage some of these European varieties at Proximity?
We have, and that was our concept from the get-go, was to look at it and saying, why, trying to pick a North American variety and an existing North American variety that may not have been bred entirely for craft. You look at European varieties that are out there; they've been bred for all malt beer for centuries. I mean, that's really the protocol that they have gone down, and the breeding path that they've gone down in the EU and in other areas there. So at our onset, we looked at it and said, we want to service specifically the craft beer industry. How do we well do that? Shortening the pipeline was a key to us to look at it and say, it's still, with all the technology that we have out there with marker-assisted selection and double haploids at Oregon State that Pat Hayes is using, it's still a 7 to 9 year process. It used to be a 10 to 12 year process to get a new barley variety rolled out. And to say that's quite a big challenge, too, would be to move that needle from where existing North American varieties that were more geared toward larger commercial beers. How do you get those traits to change? We didn't see that as happening anytime very soon. So our concept was to look at what existing deck of European style varieties were out there, or true European barleys, and what would be the best adapted varieties in each of the unique growing locations. If you look at growing locations that we're dealing with, couldn't be different than night and day. Colorado, Monte Vista, Colorado is a high mountain desert. We're 7,800 foot elevation and a nice growing season, but a relatively short growing season as compared to the Mid-Atlantic, and there where the potential there is a completely different maritime climate early on in the year, followed by some pretty rugged conditions during what would be traditionally the spring growing season. And that's where we landed on looking at winter barleys, European winter barleys, and what would be the best adapted in those locations, both agronomically and then through the malting process, and ultimately with the goal of passing that along to the craft brewers.
Does that also include importing European barley as well, or is it always planting European varieties domestically?
Our focus is to plant everything domestically, to go trying to carve out miles out of the supply chain. Granted, you can bring in European barley on large vessels, and you can do it relatively economically, but our preference obviously is to find the best variety that would work in those specific regions. And literally early on in the process, we were planting test strips or drill strips out there, bringing those varieties in and then checking them for malt quality, and ultimately passing them along to some of our brewing friends to do pilot brewing and testing for us. So that is truly our focus, would be to do everything domestically and to shorten up that supply chain.
Got it. That makes sense. Tim, I wanted to ask you, you talked earlier about sort of learning the language and, all the adaptation that's occurred in recent years from the brewer's perspective. But I want to ask you also just how your malt specifications, your process, and your relationships with maltsters has evolved to improve the beers that you're responsible for.
Well, the biggest thing is communication and making it constant. Yeah, we constantly are involved in trials throughout the entire Canarchy Craft Brewery Collective. We have the benefit of having 10 different brewing facilities scattered across the country. So and because of that, we use multiple malt houses for the reason of supply chain economics, and that Dave discussed. But it's in the end, we constantly have to draw up an actual report on how the barley is doing. especially when we're messing around with so many different varieties, and also barley types. We're using high color English style pale ales. We use a North American 2-row pale spec, like 2 to 2.3 to Lovibond. We're using Pilsner malts extensively, and knowing exactly what we're looking for and then how we can report that back to the maltster to get the conversation two-sided has been the biggest thing to evolve. And we definitely try to engage that. When we're working with almost every single maltster under the sun, some more than others, and the progress has been noticeable. We see it in brewhouse efficiency. We see it in extract yield throughout the entire production process. We see it in flavor. We see it in actual aesthetics. We see it in stability and such. But it has taken some time. Anybody that's going to get involved in the malt and barley world has to be very long-sighted, and short sight doesn't really, I wouldn't say it doesn't pay off, but it is much more cloudy when you take a short sight.
Can you give us any specific examples of that? Like maybe a specific use case where you actually said, hey, look, we need, to improve this thing, and it worked out, like a certain parameter?
Well, for us, almost every single brew house in Canarchy is a single mash infusion style. We have very few mash cookers, and even so, the economics of every single production facility is dependent upon quick turns. So we need a certain modification and uniformity in that kernel in order to effectively have gelatinization and access to starch, saccharification, and then also brewing quality to actually louder and collect that extract as quickly as possible, within reason, of course, because we don't want to do anything that affects flavor negatively. So over the last 5 years, one of the things that we've targeted very much is uniformity by communicating what we need, and then in looking at the blends, the varietal blends, and the modification on each of those varieties, and then the complete COA complete blended COA. Then we look at trends over time, and what we've looked at is things like viscosity, protein, beta-glucans, friability, all these things collectively. Over a trend with certain varieties, we've been able to get into places with each maltster to get varietal blends and products that are conducive to our process. And you can say 5 years ago, the friability that we typically would get would be mid to low 80s. Now we've noticed that low 90s is great, especially for the varieties of Copeland and Metcalf and Genie and Expedition and such, and Synergy and such. And then we pair that variability with fine coarse difference because of our limited time for gelatinization. So we are always looking for as close of a 1 as possible in fine coarse difference. And then we look at beta glucan because we actually have a target. It's not just as low as you can go. If you go as low as you can go, you might overdo it on viscosity, and then you affect flavor. But if you underdo it on beta-glucan, the beta-glucan is definitely going to affect our gelatinization and our saccharification, and therefore we're going to have much more troublesome, inconsistent extract yields. So we've brought all these parameters in line, and our targets are very much in line with what AMBA and the BA set forward about 7 years ago. But it has taken some time and communication on the part of the brewer, between the brewer and the maltster, to get to this point.
And I'll jump in there too and say Tim and his team aren't afraid to be brutally honest, and we appreciate that. You heard how knowledgeable Tim and his staff are on malt parameters and how it relates to their individual brewing processes. So for us as a maltster, having that feedback is absolutely critical there, and being able to establish those guidelines and goalposts, as I call them, and have them be realistic. Tim does work with us hand in hand here on the reality of what you're dealing with. You've got analytical parameters that are out there, but I think where they are going with it and where they have gone with it is very beneficial. We've learned a lot in working closely with the Canarchy team.
I'm sure that's a much better experience than working with a customer that just doesn't understand what questions to ask and what they want really. Coming up.
I looked at it and said, I think there are underutilized areas in the United States that would flourish using winter malting barley.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Additional support provided by
Samba Hops is first in the new exclusive BSG Hop Solutions portfolio. Named for the overwhelming tropical dance explosion of its aroma, Samba's profile is dominated by juicy tropical fruit like pineapple and mango, plus tangerine and stone fruit. Samba is ideal for late and dry hopping juicy hazy IPAs or beers that need a big tropical fruit profile. Learn more about BSG Hop Solutions online and look for more BSG Hop Solutions releases coming soon.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. Merry Christmas! District Michigan is holding a HACCP course at Bell's Brewery January 6th and 7th. District St. Louis meets January 16th. District Pittsburgh meets January 18th. District New England meets in Merrimack January 24th and 5th. The Ontario Technical Conference is January 29th through the 31st in Kingston. District St. Louis meets February 20th. District Northern California holds its technical conference February 27th and 28th in Sonoma County. One of our newest districts, District Great Plains, meets February 28th and 29th in Kansas City. Check out the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. Back in July, the vice president and technical director of AMBA made a post to community.mbaa.com that I'm going to read. He wrote, "The American Malting Barley Association, aka AMBA, publishes guidelines for malting barley breeders. These guidelines equip breeders with analytical targets for malting barley used by adjunct and all-malt brewers and distillers. In June, the AMBA Board of Directors approved changes that the Technical Committee proposed for the guidelines for malting barley breeders. The new guidelines are posted here. Specifications for 6-row malting varieties were discontinued since AMBA is no longer funding their development. Changes were also made that better clarifies the needs for brewers and distillers making all-malt products." Let's focus on that last statement. I know there was sentiment that the changes that Tim just referenced back in 2012 were a step in the right direction, but perhaps not enough. Could you comment on the 2019 updates and whether or not the current targets are on the money?
Tim, I'm going to let you jump in on from the brewing side first to say what is the impression from the craft beer industry. I know you were actively involved in helping set those guidelines, and as was I as part of the.
So they must be right.
Oh, they have to be. Yeah, they're right. End of quote. Next question. Well, this has been a work in progress. The standards set forth in 2012 were definitely raised the bar, established the bar, if anything. And now the bar is being raised mainly because the the breeder to the maltster to the brewer, we're acknowledging what is possible and sustainable. The craft brewer now is also a little bit more bold, and we're saying things like, you know what, the malt is still a little bit too hot, much less hot than before. Having no longer having enzymes, diastatic powers of the 170, 180, and getting down to 110 to 120. Over the last few years, the brewers have experienced these malts in the 100 to 120 DP range, and we've through the extensive brewing and communication and banter, we feel very confident that going after the 100 to 120 range and such, even as low as 90, can actually be used in craft brewing and in all malt. But not only that, we've heard it echoed that we can achieve that. Protein levels have to be controlled, but I believe the extensiveness of the expansiveness of how and where barley is grown, given us new possibilities for protein levels and such. We're also realizing that fan doesn't really need to be as high as it needed to be. I believe it was 220 to 230, like as soon as 5 years ago. Now we realize that, hey, anything over 170 is really good, and anything under 190 will definitely assist us for most of our brewing in terms of flavor stability, with still giving us the proper fermentation nutrient necessities. But it has come down to the fact that it's changing now because we're raising the bar once again after evaluating that first step in the last 7 years.
Since we've been talking about AMBA, Tim, do you want to comment on sort of the importance of what goes on there and maybe encourage more brewers to get involved rather than just trusting people like you to control their destinies?
Well, I will say it does take resources. The amount of information and understanding and discernment that you will glean from being part of AMBA is going to come down to how much you engage it. But you can engage it even as an associate member, but you just have to find ways to ask more questions. Hey, what is this about? If you can't supply the funds and the time to actually be part of the technical committee or the board or some of the subcommittees, then as an associate member, engage the conversation and ask questions about what is being discussed. Maybe I can interject something and such, but it will come down to engagement. It's not just one of those things that you just pay the money and then a box shows up in your doorsteps with this beautiful gift of awesome malt and malt knowledge. The advancement of the specs of the craft malt profile has been because of engagement, but it doesn't have to be just a heavily committed technical board or board member. You can ask the questions and have the conversation.
That's right. Get a seat at the table. All right. Let's shift gears and talk a little bit about winter barley. So LCS Violetta was added to AMBA's recommended list of malting barley varieties this past summer, and it's one of two malting Czech varieties for AMBA's new Eastern Winter Malting Barley Nursery. I'm now brewing with Violetta exclusively, Proximity malts a lot of Violetta. Talk about why winter barleys are important.
Winter malting barleys have been an integral part of the all-malt brewing scene in Europe for years. They're just never, with the consolidation of the brewing industry in general and the movements of the large breweries that are out there, it never seemed to catch on as a concept. I looked at it and said, I think there are underutilized areas in the United States that would flourish using winter malting barley. My experience with Violetta is in the Mid-Atlantic, and looking at it, we looked at a number of different varieties out there and worked with them. A couple were very good. Violetta stood out. It's a challenging barley to you have to pay attention to it and listen to it as it's going through the process and work with it. But on the flip side, it does well agronomically, and you look at that Mid-Atlantic region and going, spring barley just would not work in many of these underutilized areas, including the mid-Atlantic. The conditions are just too rough during the traditional spring growing season to produce a quality spring malting barley. So by planting that barley in the fall, allowing it to overwinter, you get a number of benefits there. You get a value-added cover crop for the growing community that's out there. That rather than planting, reed canary grass or something that they would just plow under, here they get the benefits of having that act as a cover crop. And when I say cover crop, that means prevents soil erosion, prevents pollutants from reaching the Chesapeake Bay, for instance, in the Delmarva Peninsula. They're a big issue there of nitrates and phosphates getting there. Barley is awesome at taking those up and utilizing them. Barley, in and of itself, the winter barley, it can put rootlets down to 6 feet deep. It's a great soil conditioner, and the growers can utilize malting barley as a value-added cover crop rather than something that they would just simply toss out. In addition to that those growers are capable, when they're harvesting barley on June 1, they're cutting barley, and immediately a day or two later, they're out in the field planting short-season soybeans. They can get a second crop in, and that becomes very, very lucrative to the growers out there. So getting growers to accept and to plant malting barley varieties is very beneficial.
Well, and there's also, some other big benefits too, is the water usage, as well as just the overall concept of like diversifying our malt supply, right? So it's not all grown in the same place if a big storm comes through and wipes it all out.
Yeah, and it's one that I didn't get into was a concern about climate change. To go look at what we're experiencing here worldwide, not just nationwide or regionally. Here we are definitely seeing some shifts in climate, and to look at that and go, if we continue to funnel malting barley into a smaller and smaller and smaller geographic location, and we don't have the ability to produce good quality malting barley in other alternative regions out here, I think that just exposes the entire industry to a lot more risk.
Agreed.
There's a quality risk there at the same time. I think this comes down to long-term sighted. And if you bring up climate change, that's the ultimate long-term sighted, long-sighted thing you must have that exists today, and it definitely affects barley. At the same time, people don't realize that some of the advents and some of the weather that occurred during climate change very much affect barley quality. So if there is abiotic stress due to climate change, then protein levels go up. And in all my years of watching barley as closely as I do now, high protein is the worst. It just interferes everywhere. It interferes with brewers' efficiency and extract yield. It interferes with the stability of the beer.
Increases DP, increases fan, all that stuff, yeah.
All these things we're trying to control. Ultimately, if we're going to adhere to these specs, we have to use all the land of this continent that we can possibly get our hands on. And we can't do that with the barley varieties that have been developed for the tiny little sliver that malting barley has been pushed up to since the mid-'80s, ever since feed barley fell off. Now we're able to use different areas. We're able to, even down in Texas, we have been working with Blacklands Malt and even Texas A&M, I think Clark Neely down there. And this is all long-term stuff, but it just goes to show that localization in barley supply can come from places that are even next door, down the street. But I know localization is definitely a big thing with brewers that focus on sustainability. But if we're looking far out, we need to be able to take advantage of every single growing area and any kind of growing window within those growing areas in order to move forward and maintain this. Otherwise, things will come to a head, and we'll have these series of years of just inconsistent roller coaster rides as we try to find our way to winter varieties or even facultative varieties that work almost any time, which are, I believe, in Albuquerque last year, the Barley Improvement Conference. Another great thing that AMBA puts on. First time I ever really saw extensive information on that. And it gives us hope that, hey, man, if we keep on it right now, collectively, we're going to be ahead of any kind of climate change, any kind of weather infrequencies and such to maintain this quality that we're striving for.
I'll follow up with that too. And on one addition, there's a 3-letter acronym out there that will literally put shivers down a malt producer's spine, and that is PHS, pre-harvest sprout. It's one of the biggest issues in the past that we've dealt with in North American spring malting barleys is rain at harvest, pre-harvest sprout, and lack and loss of germination and uncontrolled germination. If I look back at my career, it seems like every 3 to 4 or 5 years we're dealing with a PHS situation that's either local or sometimes even widespread regional. And as a maltster, if I can't get the malt to sprout and germinate uniformly, or as we're working with it, the germination percentage is dropping off and dying. To me, that's the biggest fear that we have out there.
And Dave, that's because we've bred all the dormancy out of North American barley, right?
Absolutely. That was right where I was going to go. And that's one of the wonderful benefits to working with these European varieties, is that those existing European varieties that are out there have that natural dormancy built into them. Both Genie that we're using, the spring UK variety in Colorado, and Violetta, both have a dormancy factor in there. So, as you can imagine, things sometimes get a little wet out on the eastern shore when we're harvesting in June. But even with heavy rain events right near the end of harvest here, we have not seen that pre-harvest sprout occur, simply because that barley has that built-in dormancy to it. So that is truly frosting on the cake when you're looking at a European-style variety grown locally.
Yeah, that's a good point.
More credit to the maltsters. The 2014 crop, I believe. I mean, everybody knew what PHS was, pre-harvest in the field germination was that year. But more credit to the maltsters. I don't think it was nearly felt as much by the brewers, and they don't understand how devastating it was. Like I say, high protein is high protein, and that affects the brewers because it definitely still works as malt. But PHS, it doesn't work. And brewers that year, because of the work of maltsters, didn't see it, but man, it really affected the entire barley supply chain. I think we were actually running a deficit that year, or even 2 years in a row, or 2 of 3, because of PHS and selection rates of what actually qualified as malting quality barley that year. It seems like it's an all or none, and this is why people needed to be able to engage the maltsters and understand it's a breeder, farmer, maltster, brewer collaboration and such in order to get there. But more credit to Dave and his colleagues in the malting world. PHS definitely was a devastating event, but man, they definitely shouldered the load for the most part.
We sure appreciate those kudos, Tim. It took a few years off my life, I think. I got a few more gray hairs after 2014 crop year.
Keith Armstrong was the closing speaker during the 2019 Master Brewers Conference in Calgary. He talked about how we as an industry are telling the story of beer and how we could tell it better by focusing on ingredients such as barley. Comment on that. Are we headed in the right direction or what?
Everybody is looking for something local, something done local and created local. And I think by having the concepts of regional malt, as we're talking about right now, taking the barley varieties from Europe, but because of what they're needed, but growing them locally and regionally here, having that moniker of community, if you want to call it that. I always call the craft beer industry the craft beer community, because that's part of what I think we've always been. and being able to have that capability out there to source all those materials from local raw materials and locally produced malts and even hops and other ingredients is, to me, real key. I think we can continue to focus on that. I think that that sends a great message.
Yeah. Now, it's adaptation and evolution is going to be a story, and brewers should engage it. And they can definitely engage it with barley more than any other crop. I don't know, definitely more than hops. Hops will have their little area, it seems, just by nature of the beast. But there's even evolution and adaptation there. But in barley, it's just a different, a very different beast, and it's because of that long-term approach and how it's affected and how it's part of a rotation, and it's different in every single area. So are the brewers; those are different in every single area, and if they're able to include their barley, and if especially if they're able to do it on a local level, then they will have more of a story. If you look to just homogenizing it and making it just in an industrial level thing. Now, I will say big maltsters will play a big game and a big role in advancing this, but you can't not everything can come from there. Let's look at things on as holistic a level as possible and adapt with the climate, adapt with the cultural developments, and adapt with how economy develops and evolves over the next few years.
I'll throw one more quote in there too. I forget who made it. I'll probably be quoting wrong. I think it might have been Dan Carey, but he always said somebody had always said barley is to beer what grapes are to wine, and I strongly believe in that.
That was Dave Kuske and Tim Matthews here on the Master Brewers Podcast. Check the show notes for links to the American Malting Barley Association's guidelines and how you can get involved in that process. Don't forget to ask your district officers if you can help them get those district presentations uploaded to the archive. And drop me a line if you think there's a presenter we should have on the show. All the links you need are in the show notes. Are you enjoying the Master Brewers Podcast? Let me tell you about a simple way you can help us keep making more. Take a minute to thank our sponsors. There's no way we could produce this show without generous support from sponsors like Hopsteiner, ABS, Proximity Malt, and BSG. So please, let them know you heard their message on the Master Brewers Podcast and that you appreciate their support.